If you think your life is hard, it is doubtful you would last a single day in medieval times. Our modern comforts have made us soft, and the daily struggles medieval people faced would likely shock you to your core. The reality of their food alone would have you running back to the 21st century faster than you can say McDonald's. It is best to forget everything seen in movies depicting grand feasts with giant turkey legs. As for regular folks, meals were bland, boring, and frequently dangerous. Most people subsisted on a diet that was about as exciting as watching paint dry. Peasants lived mainly on a substance called pottage, which was essentially a sad, watery soup made from whatever vegetables they could grow, often cooked in the same pot for days. It was the medieval equivalent of a mystery stew, except instead of hiding vegetables, it often concealed weevils and dirt. Bread was the staple food for nearly everyone, but it was not the fluffy, sliced variety we enjoy today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and frequently filled with all sorts of unwanted extras. The flour used was typically ground between stone wheels that would inevitably chip off into the mix, meaning people back then had stronger teeth. Not from good genetics, but from constantly chewing on what was essentially rock-filled dough. A truly terrifying fact is that much of the bread contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning could cause hallucinations, burning sensations, and sometimes death. Some historians even believe this poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria, as entire towns would start hallucinating at once. Imagine thinking your neighbor is a witch, when in reality, your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Meat was a luxury for most people, and when they did manage to get it, it was often borderline rotten due to the complete lack of refrigeration. To mask the taste of spoiling meat, they used heavy spices if they could afford them. Otherwise, one simply held their nose and hoped for the best. The 5-second rule of modern times was more akin to a 5-day rule in the medieval era. Compounding this, you could not even wash down this awful food with water, because drinking it would likely make you sick, as most water sources were contaminated with human waste and other nasty substances. Instead, everyone, including children, drank beer or ale. This was not the strong brew we have today, but a weaker version that was safer than water because the brewing process killed the germs. One study found that the average medieval peasant consumed about 8 pints of ale per day. After a day of eating questionable food and drinking ale to avoid waterborne illness, the simple act of relieving yourself presented its own set of horrors. For the average person, going to the bathroom meant using a chamber pot, which was just a bowl or bucket kept under the bed. Once it was filled, you would either empty it yourself or wait for someone to collect it. The contents were usually disposed of by being tossed right out the window and into the street below. The common practice in towns was to simply shout "Garde-à-l'eau" before tossing waste from upper windows, a warning derived from the French phrase "garde-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, though the liquid was far less pleasant. This practice was so prevalent that in some medieval cities, a rule stipulated that waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 at night. If you were fortunate enough to visit a castle, you might encounter a garderobe, which was essentially a hole in a stone seat that dropped waste straight down the castle wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered a garderobe with a drop of nearly 70 feet. Even kings and queens with their thrones had toilets that were little more than drafty holes. For those who could not wait to get home to their chamber pot, public options were grim, often consisting of designated spots that created what we would now call open sewers. In London, there were places called common privies built over rivers. But these were few and far between. The task of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to workers with the unfortunate title of gong farmers. These brave souls collected waste from cesspits and took it outside the city walls, working only at night. The smell clung to them so badly they were barred from public gathering places, though despite the awful conditions they were paid quite well. The stench of medieval cities was legendary. With London's River Thames being so polluted with waste, it was described as a monster of stink. As for toilet paper, you can forget about it. People used whatever was available, such as leaves, moss, their left hand, or, if they were wealthy, pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had used sponges on sticks rinsed in vinegar or salt water, but this knowledge was mostly lost by medieval times. Beyond the issues of food and sanitation, life was a daily test of survival filled with other brutal realities. Forget romantic notions of being a valiant knight or a fair maiden, as most people worked back-breaking jobs from sunrise to sunset with barely enough pay to survive. The majority were peasant farmers toiling on land owned by nobles, their routine being to wake at dawn, work until dusk, collapse into bed, and repeat until death. A typical farmer plowed fields with wooden tools pulled by oxen, planted seeds by hand, and harvested crops with basic sickles. During the harvest season, peasants worked 16-hour days in the baking sun, with records from medieval England showing that a typical farm worker would burn over 4,000 calories daily just from physical labor. For those not farming, trades and crafts offered alternative careers, though these came with their own hardships. Blacksmiths spent their days in smoke-filled forges, breathing in toxic fumes and risking burns and eye injuries. Tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, worked with urine and toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and gave them a horrible smell that followed them everywhere. To become a skilled tradesperson, one had to start young, with apprenticeships typically beginning at age 7, when children were sent to live with a master craftsman for up to 14 years. The pay for most jobs would barely cover basic survival. A day laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy about 2 loaves of bread. The concept was not a minimum wage, but the minimum required so you would not die before finishing your work. With such physically demanding labor and poor nutrition, the body would wear out quickly. Disease was everywhere. Medicine was practically non-existent, and what passed for healthcare would today be considered torture. A simple cold or flu could be a death sentence. Without an understanding of germs, medieval people believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had a fever, it was time for bloodletting, which involved cutting a vein and draining blood into a bowl. Leeches were another popular treatment, with these blood-sucking parasites applied to the skin to draw out bad blood. One medical text recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. The bubonic plague alone killed roughly half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were particularly awful, as with no proper toothbrushes or understanding of hygiene. Tooth decay was rampant. The medicines that were available were often deadly, with mercury being prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. The worst part was that many diseases spread due to a poor understanding of hygiene, as their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their palms on their already filthy clothes. Even if you somehow survived these medieval medical treatments, your troubles were far from over, as the justice system was downright cruel, unfair, and often completely random. Laws varied wildly from one town to the next, and punishments rarely fit the crime. Minor offenses like stealing food could result in having a hand chopped off, and over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty in England. Proving your innocence often involved a trial by ordeal. One method was making the accused carry a red-hot iron bar. If the burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. But if they became infected, which was almost guaranteed, you were guilty. Another method was trial by water, where the accused was thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and subsequently executed, creating a literal no-win situation. For those found guilty, execution methods were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. Hanging was one of the more merciful options, while drawing and quartering was reserved for the worst crimes like treason. These public executions were community events that drew huge crowds. Nobles, however, rarely faced the same justice system. They could demand trial by combat and hire a professional fighter, or pay blood money to a victim's family to avoid punishment. Medieval prisons were merely holding cells where prisoners, often chained to walls, relied on family for food or simply starved. Torture was a standard part of the process, used to extract confessions with devices like the rack and thumb screws. Public humiliation, such as being locked in the stocks or dunked on a ducking stool, was a common punishment for minor offenses. Medieval warfare was nothing like what is depicted in movies. Real combat was chaotic, brutal, and almost certainly fatal for the average person. Wars were constant, such as the 100 Years' War, which subjected generations to conflict. Only the wealthiest knights could afford full plate armor, which cost the equivalent of a modern sports car. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments, and their weapons were often spears, axes, or modified farm tools. The English longbow was a feared weapon, capable of piercing most armor, but its users trained from childhood, developing deformed skeletons from the strain. Battles were incredibly lethal, with the Battle of Tautan in 1461, seeing roughly 28,000 men die in a single day from Mufresen's. Battle wounds were almost always fatal due to infection, even if not immediately life-threatening. For peasants, the worst part of war was not the battles but what armies did between them. Soldiers lived off the land, taking food and supplies from local villages, burning crops and destroying homes, leaving civilians to starve. Sieges were particularly horrific, trapping inhabitants in castles or towns to face slow starvation, sometimes resorting to cannibalism. The Siege of Candia, modern Heraklion, lasted 21 years. Disease killed far more soldiers than combat, as armies created perfect conditions for illness with poor sanitation and contaminated water. Civilians caught in war zones faced terrible choices, as fleeing meant abandoning everything, while staying meant risking violence from passing armies. Entire villages were sometimes slaughtered, regardless of age or gender. If you somehow avoided war, you still had to endure the misery of everyday life. The smell of medieval towns was an overwhelming assault of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and industrial chemicals. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent, with most people bathing only a few times a year, believing it opened the pores to disease. Head lice were so common that special combs for removing them were standard grooming tools. Clothing was uncomfortable, rarely washed, and worn until it fell apart. The language barrier would also be nearly insurmountable, as Middle English from the 1400s is almost a foreign language to modern speakers. Privacy was an unknown concept, with entire families eating, working, and sleeping in a single room, often sharing beds with multiple people. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, with the feudal system fixing everyone in their place and making social mobility nearly impossible. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing. Knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the gaps, with widespread belief in witches, demons, and magical creatures. A solar eclipse could send a town into a panic, believing the world was ending. Communication was slow, with news traveling at the speed of a walking messenger, taking days or even months to arrive from other countries. By this point, you would be desperately searching for a way back to your comfortable modern life, with its antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and deodorant. The past may seem romantic in books and movies, but the reality of medieval life was a daily struggle that few of us could endure. So, forget the fairy tales. Set aside the Hollywood epics with their gleaming halls and dashing knights. If you've ever wondered what it was truly like to live in a medieval castle, from the moment the sun peeked over the battlements to the last flicker of candlelight, prepare for a journey that's equal parts fascinating, uncomfortable, and, let's be honest, occasionally a bit smelly. Let's start at dawn, when even kings and queens awoke with aching backs. Today we grumble about memory foam mattresses being too soft or too firm. Medieval sleepers, by contrast, spent their nights on sacks of straw, often unchanged since the last harvest. The situation was so dire that medieval medical texts actually included treatments for straw injuries. Yes, people were wounded by their own beds. Imagine explaining that to your local healer. I was attacked by my mattress. If you were lucky enough to be a noble, you might have a wooden bed frame to elevate your straw, which was about as comfortable as sleeping on a shelf. Forget the gentle chime of a smartphone alarm. Your wake-up call was more likely to be a rooster with a flair for the dramatic. Or worse, the castle's designated human alarm clock, a servant whose sole job was to march through the halls at dawn, bellowing the medieval equivalent of wakey wakey. A role guaranteed to make you the least popular person in the castle. And then there was the cold. Castles were built to keep out armies, not drafts. Those thick stone walls were excellent at repelling invaders, but they also turned your bedroom into a giant refrigerator. Most people slept in their clothes, not out of laziness, but to avoid waking up as a human icicle. Windows were narrow slits, designed for archers, not sunlight. On a cloudy morning, which in medieval Europe was most mornings, you might wake in total darkness, stub your toe on a chamber pot, and start your day with a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. Once you'd extricated yourself from your straw torture device, it was time for personal hygiene, a concept with very flexible boundaries in the Middle Ages. The first thing you'd notice was a bucket of water so cold it might still have ice floating in it. No hot showers, no temperature control. Just you and the bucket, locked in mortal combat. Some castles tried to innovate. One French fortress piped water past the kitchen fires to warm it. A clever idea, except the pipes were made of lead. So you faced a choice, stay dirty or risk slow poisoning. Not exactly a win-win. Soap, too, was a luxury. Most people washed with a gritty mixture of wood ash and animal fat, essentially fireplace residue. The wealthy might splurge on Castile soap, made with olive oil, but it was so expensive that a single bar could cost as much as a sheep. Imagine spending your entire paycheck on soap. And then, of course, there was the matter of the castle toilet. Those narrow windows, they doubled as garderobes, medieval restrooms where people hung their clothes, believing the stench would keep moths away. If you didn't have a garderobe nearby, you used a chamber pot, which was then emptied out the window, the phrase garde as low. Watch out for the water, wasn't a warning about rain. Some cities even passed laws requiring you to shout before dumping your pot. A rare example of medieval public health policy. Communal latrines were another story. Built into the outer walls, they were essentially holes that dropped everything straight down. Archaeologists have found all sorts of things in these ancient waste chutes, not just coins and jewelry, but the detritus of daily life. In a castle housing 200 people, privacy was a foreign concept. Even kings and queens might receive visitors while on the throne. Being invited to witness the royal morning routine was considered an honor. Imagine being so important that people wanted to watch you use the bathroom. After all that, you'd be ready for breakfast. Though breakfast might be a generous term, the king dined on fresh bread, roasted meats, and exotic fruits, while the lower ranks got pottage, a stew of whatever vegetables hadn't yet spoiled boiled into submission. Bread wasn't just for eating. Nobles used thick slices of stale bread as plates, called trenchers. After a few days, these rock-hard slabs were handed out to the poor, who needed teeth stronger than armor to chew them. Water was often unsafe to drink, thanks to the castle's creative waste disposal methods. The solution: beer. Lots of it. Even children drank a weak version called small beer. One castle's records show they went through 3,000 pints a day. The castle brewer was as vital as the blacksmith. Mess up the beer and you'd have a castle full of thirsty, irate residents. Table manners were evolving. Forks were considered suspiciously Italian, so everyone ate with their fingers. One etiquette guide warned, "Do not wipe your greasy hands on your beard." The seating chart was a political minefield. Sitting close to the Lord meant you were in favor, while a seat at the far end signaled disgrace. Salt was so valuable that knights once fought a duel over who got to sit nearest the salt cellar, the medieval equivalent of fighting over the Wi-Fi password. The castle's great hall was a riot of activity and aroma. Floors were covered in rushes, layers of dried grass and herbs, replaced only once a year. Fresh rushes were scattered on top every few weeks, but underneath lay a year's worth of spilled food, mud, and animal droppings. Lavender and meadow herbs were added in a valiant attempt to mask the stench, but the effect was more compost heap than country garden. Animals roamed freely. Dogs, cats, chickens, even the occasional pig. One account describes a nobleman's falcon relieving itself on the dinner table, to little comment. The walls, meanwhile, sweated with damp, growing mold behind rarely cleaned tapestry. The kitchen was its own olfactory adventure, with food waste, unwashed dishes, and meat kept just this side of rotten masked by heroic quantities of spice. And then there were the garderobes, emptying straight down the castle walls into the moat. In summer, the stench was so fierce that some attackers abandoned their siege. Medieval biological warfare, if you will. Castles weren't just homes, they were fortresses bristling with defensive features. Walls could be 20 feet thick at the base. Arrow slits allowed defenders to shoot at attackers while staying protected. Some archers became so skilled they could hit a dinner plate at 200 yards, though ironically, many couldn't hit the latrine in broad daylight. Murder holes in the ceilings above entryways allowed defenders to drop rocks, boiling oil, or even beehives on invaders. Everyone had a role during a siege, even children who acted as messengers or water carriers. Some kids turned sieges into games, lobbing rotten vegetables at each other from the towers. The moat wasn't just for show. Some could be flooded or drained in an hour, confounding attackers. The drawbridge operator had one job: don't mess up. Yet records tell of bridges raised too soon, stranding soldiers outside or lowered at the wrong moment. Spiral staircases always wound clockwise going up, giving right-handed defenders an advantage. The steps were intentionally uneven, so attackers would stumble while defenders dashed up and down with ease. Home field advantage, medieval style. Life in a castle was a constant hustle. A medium-sized castle might employ 200 people, each with a job title that would raise eyebrows today. The gong farmer cleaned out the toilets at night to spare others the smell and was paid surprisingly well. Kitchen staff worked around the clock, churning out 6,000 calories per person per day. Og de dagste the bees porv, tinchisen and roll. So these canoes. The turnbroach, often a small boy, spent his days turning the spit over the fire. Guards sang on duty to prove they were awake. One logbook notes, nothing to report except Ralph's terrible singing. The lady of the castle was the real CEO, managing everything from food supplies to staff disputes. One account book lists everything from eggs laid to arrows wasted, with a note in the margin. Stop paying archers when drunk. Terrible aim. When the lord was away, the lady might even lead the defense during a siege, using empty wine barrels to create the illusion of more soldiers. Feeling unwell, the castle physician might prescribe powdered emerald for headaches, or if you were short on gems, powdered human skull. Some treatments involve strapping a shaved chicken to your head and waiting for it to look sick, on the theory that it would absorb your fever. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. The best you could hope for was a strong drink beforehand. The medicine cabinet was a cabinet of curiosities. Dragon's blood, unicorn horn, mummy powder. Yes, real mummies, imported from Egypt. Dental care was equally creative. Toothache, the barber surgeon would either pull the tooth or fill it with lead. One knight had all his teeth removed before battle to avoid distractions, yet by accident or luck some remedies worked. Herbs with natural antibiotics, wine and honey as antiseptics. Sometimes medieval medicine got it right, even if for the wrong reasons. As night fell, the castle transformed. Candles were precious, so darkness reigned. Guards patrolled with torches, their flickering light making every shadow seem alive. Ghost stories were taken seriously. Some castles even required formal reports of ghost sightings, complete with descriptions of the apparition's outfit. One guard noted a ghost in last season's tunic and suggested a wardrobe update. The dungeons, meanwhile, were less torture chamber and more uncomfortable timeout corner. Most were the size of a modern bathroom, but without the plumbing. Prisoners had to pay for their own food and bedding. Nobles sometimes brought their own servants. One even insisted on a food taster, who resigned after a week, declaring that gruel tasting was not in his job description. Most inmates were debtors, imprisoned for sums as small as the price of a haircut. Escape attempts were rare. Where would you go when everyone in the village knew your face? One man tried to escape disguised as a washerwoman, only to be recognized by his own mother and dragged back by the ear. So what was it really like to live in a medieval castle? It was a world of hard beds and harder bread, of ingenious defenses and creative plumbing, of ceaseless work and raucous feasts, of ghost stories and real-life horrors. It was a place where survival depended on teamwork, quick wits, and a strong stomach. Yet for all its discomforts, the castle was also a marvel of human ingenuity, a fortress, a home, a community, and a stage for the dramas of history. From the highest tower to the deepest dungeon, every day was a new adventure, and every night a new story waiting to be told. So next time you visit a castle, don't just marvel at the stonework. Listen for the echoes of laughter, the clatter of dishes, the distant strains of a jester's song. Imagine the lives lived within those walls, messy, noisy, and utterly unforgettable. That in all its gritty glory was the real medieval castle experience. Let's be honest. If you're someone who prefers to skip a shower now and then, You might imagine you'd fit right in during the Middle Ages. After all, isn't that the era we picture as a time of mud-caked peasants and unwashed nobles, where bathing was a rare and suspicious luxury? But history, as it so often does, has a way of surprising us. Welcome, fellow time travelers. Today, let's journey back to the medieval world, not just to peek at castles and cathedrals, but to explore the everyday rituals of cleanliness, the ingenious and sometimes odd ways people fought filth, and the real story behind medieval hygiene. Imagine slipping into a medieval tunic or lying down on a straw mattress. Chances are, you'd soon be scratching. Lice and fleas were the constant companions of rich and poor alike, infesting clothing, bedding, and hair. Even the most pious monks and the wealthiest lords weren't spared. Saint Francis of Assisi, in a moment of spiritual humor, once called these pests the pearls of poverty. Combating these unwelcome guests was a daily battle. Women armed with small brooms would sweep through hair and garments, often near windows or fires where the light and warmth helped in the hunt. The goal? To rid heads and homes of these bloodthirsty intruders as quickly as possible. If you think the tap water in your city is questionable, spare a thought for medieval townsfolk. Rivers and streams, the lifeblood of cities and castles, were often choked with waste. Everything from household garbage to, well, less mentionable refuse. Wells, too, could become tainted as growing populations contaminated the groundwater. Some cities, like Siena, tried valiantly to regulate access to clean water, but with little success. The result? Many people turned to beer and wine as their daily drink. Not just for the taste, but because it was often safer than water. Water, in fact, was considered a drink for the poor, and its impurity was widely feared. In some places, rainwater was collected in cisterns. But this was a luxury for the wealthy, and even then the water was not always safe. But don't think medieval people ignored dental hygiene. Far from it. Cleaning between the teeth was a must, even if the tools were a bit rustic. The first toothbrushes were often hazel twigs, one end wrapped in cloth. Some chewed on marshmallow plant roots, mint leaves, or fennel and anise seeds to freshen their breath. Others rinsed their mouths with water or even wine mixed with vinegar. A medieval mouthwash, if you will. There are even records of tooth powders made from crushed herbs, salt, and sometimes charcoal, which people would rub on their teeth with a cloth or a finger. Bathing in the Middle Ages was rarely a solitary act. Public baths, rivers, and streams were common gathering places. Even private baths in castles were elaborate affairs, requiring teams of servants to haul and heat water. Once the tub was ready, it was not unusual for several people to take turns using the same bath water, sometimes with an attendant on hand to ensure no one bathed alone. For women, hair washing was a weekly ritual, often reserved for Saturdays. The process was a team effort. One would pour water from a jug while another scrubbed with a homemade shampoo of oils, herbs, and minerals. Peasant women washed their hair less frequently, but the method was much the same. In some regions, bathhouses were as common as taverns, and people gathered there not just to get clean, but to socialize, eat, and even conduct business. In fact, in cities like Paris and London, bathhouses were lively social centers, sometimes so lively that authorities tried to shut them down for being too rowdy or morally questionable. Soap in the Middle Ages was a far cry from the perfumed bars we know today. Recipes varied. Some used a mix of lemon and salt to create an alkaline cleaner, while others combined wood ash with lard or olive oil. Northern Europeans favored animal fat, while those in the Mediterranean preferred oil. The wealthy might enjoy scented soaps shaped into balls or bars, but the poor made do with harsh, lye-heavy versions that could strip the skin as easily as they removed dirt. Soap was often made at home, or by local soap makers, and the process could be smelly and labor-intensive. In some places, soap was so valuable it was locked away and used sparingly. Surprisingly, medieval scholars took hygiene seriously. The Faculty of Medicine at Salerno, one of Europe's leading medical schools, published guides to healthy living as early as the 12th century. Drawing on ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts, these guides recommended washing hands and face with cold water each morning, stretching, combing hair, and brushing teeth, habits that sound remarkably modern. Monasteries often had running water and even primitive forms of indoor plumbing, with pipes made from lead or hollowed-out logs. Some monasteries built elaborate bath complexes for the sick and elderly, and the word spa itself comes from the Belgian town of Spa, famous since the Middle Ages for its healing mineral springs. Of course, not all medieval hygiene practices would pass modern muster. Perfumes and scented sachets were popular ways to mask unpleasant odors, and people often carried pulmanders, small fragrant balls, on their belts or around their necks. In winter, when water was scarce or frozen, dry washing with cloths and powders was common, and changing into fresh linen was considered almost as good as a bath. Even the humble act of hand-washing had its place in medieval etiquette. At feasts, a servant would bring a basin and ewer to each guest before the meal, and washing hands was a sign of good manners and respect for others. Toilets, too, were more advanced than we might imagine. Many castles and monasteries had garderobes, stone or wooden seats built over chutes that emptied into moats or cesspits. In cities, public latrines were sometimes available, though they could be unpleasant, and chamber pots were a household staple. Waste management was a constant challenge, and city authorities struggled to keep streets and waterways clean, sometimes issuing fines for dumping refuse in public places. So was the medieval world a cesspool of filth and disease? Not quite. While their standards and resources were different from ours, medieval people cared about cleanliness and developed creative ways to stay healthy. Their world was one of constant adaptation, where the fight against dirt and disease was as much a part of daily life as prayer or work. Next time you grumble about having to shower or brush your teeth, remember, you're part of a long, inventive tradition of humans striving for cleanliness, even when the odds and the lice were stacked against them. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, share it with a friend and keep your curiosity alive. History, after all, is full of surprises, sometimes even in the bath. And perhaps the most refreshing fact of all is that across centuries and continents, people have always found ways to care for themselves and each other, proving that the pursuit of cleanliness is as old as civilization itself. When we think of medieval castles, there's a sense of romance and adventure, a promise of safety behind thick walls, and the thrill of living like royalty. But how much of this is true, and how much is just Hollywood magic? Let's take a journey back in time. Not as a knight in shining armor, but as a curious traveler, eager to discover the real story behind those ancient walls. First, let's set the scene. Castles were, above all, fortresses. Imagine a giant stone bunker, built to withstand sieges and keep enemies at bay. The walls were thick and cold, the windows narrow slits designed more for archers than for sunlight. Inside, the air was often damp and heavy, carrying the scent of smoke, sweat, and something less pleasant, decay. If you were lucky enough to be born into nobility, you might enjoy a few comforts: a private chamber with a fireplace, a feather bed, and perhaps a rare steaming bath. Servants would bustle about, tending to your needs. But even the grandest rooms were chilly and dim by modern standards. Now, spare a thought for the servants. Their quarters were tucked away in the coldest, darkest corners of the castle, places where sunlight was a stranger and warmth a luxury. Privacy was almost non-existent, and disease spread quickly in these crowded communal spaces. For many, life in the castle was a daily struggle against the elements, exhaustion, and illness. Castles were not just homes for a single family. They were bustling hubs, packed with relatives, guests, and a small army of servants. Keeping everything running smoothly required dozens of hands, from cooks and cleaners to stable boys and guards. For the servants, there was little rest. Work began at sunrise and often continued long after sunset, especially in the winter months when daylight was precious. Let's talk about something rarely shown in the movies: the medieval bathroom. Forget porcelain toilets and running water. Instead, picture a wooden bench with a hole perched above a cesspit. Sometimes these benches were lined up side by side, turning a private moment into a social affair. Imagine discussing battle plans while taking care of business. The smell? Unforgettable, and not in a good way. And when the cesspit overflowed, well, let's just say it was a job no one wanted. Privacy was minimal, and cleaning up was left to the lowest-ranking servants, with no toilet paper in sight, just straw, moss, or scraps of cloth. Beneath the grandeur, castles hid a darker side. Dungeons were real, and they were as grim as you might imagine, cold, damp, and echoing with the sounds of suffering. These were places of punishment and fear, where the unlucky might find themselves chained to the walls, awaiting an uncertain fate. Some castles even had murder holes above the main entrance, where defenders could pour boiling water, hot sand, or even beehives down on unwelcome guests. Spiral staircases almost always wound clockwise, giving right-handed defenders an advantage over attackers whose sword arms would be cramped by the central column. Even the smallest architectural choices were shaped by the constant threat of conflict. If you lived in a castle, you shared your home with uninvited guests. Rats, they scurried through the halls, gnawed at stores of grain, and spread disease. The most infamous of these was the Black Death, a plague that swept through Europe and claimed millions of lives. For many, the castle's thick walls offered little protection from the invisible enemies within. Dark, damp, and cold environments were perfect breeding grounds for all sorts of pests, and people simply accepted the rat infestation as a part of normal life. One small mercy: the wine and ale flowed freely. In fact, it was often safer to drink alcohol than water, which was usually contaminated. Meals could be hearty, especially for the lords and ladies, but the servants made do with simpler fare. Castles had their own kitchens, and sometimes even breweries and bakeries within their walls. The great halls where feasts were held would have been filled with the sounds of minstrels, the smells of roasting meat, and the flicker of torchlight on polished armor. Despite the gray stone we see today, many castles were once decorated with bright murals and tapestries, both to impress visitors and to help insulate against the cold. As for bathing, that was a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. Hauling water through narrow corridors and heating it over open fires was a monumental task, so most people simply didn't bother. In some cases, bathing once a year was considered sufficient. Yet, castles were also places of innovation. The drawbridge and portcullis were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to keep enemies out. Some castles even had early forms of central heating, called hypocausts, which channeled warm air under the floors, though only the wealthiest lords could afford such luxuries. Despite the hardships, castles were centers of culture and learning. Some lords and ladies could read and write, and a few castles even had libraries filled with precious manuscripts. Traveling minstrels and troubadours brought news and entertainment from distant lands, and great feasts were occasions for music, dancing, and storytelling. Castles also had their own gardens, not just for beauty but for survival. Herbs for medicine and cooking, vegetables, and even small orchards were carefully tended within the safety of the walls. In times of siege, these gardens could mean the difference between life and death. Castles were surprisingly noisy places. The clatter of horses in the courtyard, the clang of blacksmiths at work, and the constant chatter of servants filled the air. At night, the only light came from flickering torches or candles made of animal fat, which gave off more smoke than brightness. The smell of smoke, mixed with the odors of animals, people, and food, was ever present. And while we often imagine castles as isolated, they were usually the heart of a bustling community. Markets would spring up outside the gates, and villagers relied on the castle for protection in troubled times. The castle was a symbol of power, but also a place of refuge, work, and daily life for hundreds of people. Daily life was a blend of hardship and celebration. Festivals and tournaments brought moments of joy and spectacle, with jousting knights, jesters, and elaborate costumes. Children played games we'd still recognize today, like tag and hide and seek, while adults gathered for storytelling and music on long winter nights. Yet for all their splendor and strength, castles were never truly comfortable. The drafty halls, the ever-present threat of disease, and the rigid social hierarchy made life challenging for everyone, from the highest lord to the humblest servant. Still, these stone giants have stood the test of time, bearing witness to centuries of human drama, ingenuity, and resilience. So while the idea of living in a castle might seem enchanting, the reality was a mix of discomfort, ingenuity, and resilience. Castles were not just stone and mortar. They were living, breathing worlds full of stories waiting to be discovered. Next time you walk through those ancient halls, remember, every echo is a reminder of the people who once called these fortresses home, and the remarkable lives they led within those mighty walls. Step into the time machine of your imagination and set the dials for the so-called Dark Ages. The name alone conjures images of shadowy castles, grimy peasants, and a world shrouded in ignorance. But history, as it so often does, delights in surprising us. The medieval era was anything but a stagnant backwater. It was a time of dazzling innovation, vibrant culture, and mysteries that still puzzle us today. So, fellow explorers, are you ready to journey into the heart of the Middle Ages? Let's cast aside the cliches and discover the real stories, full of strange fashions, curious customs, and the everyday lives of people not so different from ourselves. Imagine walking down a bustling street in 14th century London. What catches your eye? Perhaps it's the shoes. Leather slippers with toes so long and pointed they could double as a weapon or a conversation starter. These were the poulaines, the must-have fashion statement for medieval men. Some shoes stretched several inches beyond the foot. A symbol of status and, let's be honest, a bit of medieval swagger. Not everyone was a fan. Church officials frowned upon these extravagant shoes, claiming they made it difficult to kneel in prayer. Yet even some clerics couldn't resist the trend. There was a price to pay for style. Archaeologists have found that nearly a third of wealthy medieval skeletons show signs of bunions, painful foot deformities likely caused by these fashionable but impractical shoes. Among friars, the rate was even higher. It seems the pursuit of style over comfort is a tale as old as time. When did people marry in the Middle Ages? The answer is as varied as the people themselves. On average, men tied the knot around age 20, while women often married in their late teens. But the rules were flexible, shaped by local customs, family fortunes, and the ever-watchful eye of the church. Canon law set the minimum ages, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. Betrothals could happen even earlier, especially among the nobility, where marriage was as much about politics and property as it was about love. For most, though, marriage was a practical affair, an alliance of families, a way to secure the future, and sometimes a leap into the unknown. Medieval life was never far from the threat of conflict. Training for battle began early, often through games, tournaments, and mock fights that honed the skills needed for real warfare. In the early Middle Ages, training was informal, more a matter of necessity than discipline. By the late Middle Ages, detailed combat manuals appeared, reflecting the growing sophistication of military tactics. Yet even as armies became more organized, the idea of a permanent professional force was rare. It wasn't until the mid-15th century, during the 100 Years' War, that France created one of the first standing armies in Europe, a sign of how much the art of war had changed. What about women? While their primary responsibilities often centered on the home, women's lives were far from confined. During harvest, they joined men in the fields. Noble women, meanwhile, could be found hunting, managing estates, and even defending castles in times of siege. The medieval world was complex, and women's roles were as varied as the society itself. Some women became powerful abbesses, managing large religious communities and even advising kings. Others, like Hildegard of Bingen, became renowned for their scholarship, music, and scientific observations, showing that intellectual life was not reserved for men alone. No medieval fair or court was complete without music. Enter the minstrels and troubadours, wandering performers who brought news, stories, and songs to life. Some recited epic tales of heroes and battles. Others composed their own verses, accompanied by lutes, harps, or early violins. Their music was the social media of the day, spreading news and entertainment across kingdoms. Troubadours in southern France even invented new forms of poetry and song, influencing European literature for centuries to come. Here's a riddle. If you lived in a medieval village, would you know what year it was? For most, the answer was not exactly. Few could read or write, and the concept of a numbered year mattered little in daily life. What mattered was the rhythm of the seasons, the time to plant, to harvest, to celebrate religious festivals. Monks and royal officials kept track of years, but for the average person, time was measured in cycles, not numbers. The church calendar, with its saints' days and feast days, was the true clock of the countryside. Pilgrimages were the great adventures of the Middle Ages. People traveled for weeks or months to visit holy sites, hoping for miracles or forgiveness. Seeing a relic, a saint's bone, a splinter of the true cross, was a highlight. There was no ticket booth, but pilgrims often made offerings, both as a sign of devotion and to support the church. The authenticity of relics was sometimes questionable, but their power to inspire awe was very real. Pilgrimages also helped spread ideas, art, and even new foods across Europe, as travelers brought back stories and souvenirs from distant lands. Medieval manuscripts show fishermen with nets and rods, proving that angling was both a necessity and a pastime. Meanwhile, the world of money was changing fast. Catholic rules against usury, charging interest, meant that Jewish families often became bankers, filling a vital role in the growing economy. By the 14th century, new types of bankers emerged: merchant bankers, moneylenders, and deposit bankers, each navigating the tricky waters of commerce, faith, and law. Records from Italy and beyond show that debt collection was serious business, sometimes continuing even after a person's death. The rise of banking was a sign of a world becoming more connected, more ambitious, and more modern than we might expect. Medieval people, far from being isolated, were part of a world more connected than we often imagine. Trade routes stretched from English ports to the markets of Venice, and from there, goods and ideas traveled as far as the Middle East and China. Spices, silks, and stories all made their way into medieval homes, changing tastes and sparking new inventions. Even the humble fork, now a staple at every dinner table, was a medieval innovation that took centuries to catch on in Europe. For a long time, people ate with knives, spoons, and their fingers. When the fork finally arrived, it was considered scandalously decadent by some. Proof that even the smallest changes could stir up big debates. Medieval cities, too, were marvels of ingenuity. London, Paris, and Florence bustled with markets, universities, and guilds. The first universities like Bologna and Oxford were founded in this era, where students debated philosophy, medicine, and law. The great cathedrals, with their soaring arches and stained glass, were not just places of worship, but also centers of art, science, and community life. Building them required advanced mathematics and engineering, and their beauty still inspires awe today. Medieval engineers also built aqueducts, windmills, and water wheels, harnessing the power of nature in ways that would lay the groundwork for later technological revolutions. Let's not forget the written word. While most people could not read, the Middle Ages saw the slow but steady spread of literacy. Monks in quiet scriptoria copied ancient texts by hand, preserving the wisdom of Greece and Rome. By the late Middle Ages, the invention of the printing press would soon revolutionize the world, making books and knowledge available to more people than ever before. The spread of paper from China through the Islamic world and into Europe made writing cheaper and more accessible, fueling a quiet revolution in communication. So the next time you hear the phrase Dark Ages, remember the light that shone through, the laughter of minstrels, the courage of knights and scholars, the hands that built cathedrals, and the minds that dreamed of a wider world. The Middle Ages were not just a bridge between ancient and modern. They were a world of their own, full of color, curiosity, and the same human spirit that drives us today. Thank you for traveling through time with me. Keep your sense of wonder alive, and who knows what other secrets history might reveal. Imagine, for a moment, that you've been whisked back to the Middle Ages. If you think life then was all feasting, jousting, and grand adventures, think again. Simply surviving from one day to the next was an adventure in itself, especially if you ever found yourself in need of a doctor. Or, more likely, a barber. Yes, you read that right. In medieval Europe, the local barber was more than just the person who trimmed your beard. He was the community's multitasker-in-chief, part hairdresser, part surgeon, part dentist, and when the need arose, part pharmacist. Medical science was still in its infancy, and unless you were lucky enough to be born into royalty, your best hope for treatment was the steady hand of the barber surgeon. So what did medical care look like in those days? Let's embark on a journey through some of the strangest, most eyebrow-raising treatments from the Middle Ages. Prepare yourself. Some of these remedies are not for the faint of heart or the weak of stomach. The arrival of gunpowder in the 9th century changed warfare forever, and with it, the nature of battlefield injuries. Before the French barber surgeon Ambroise Paré revolutionized wound care, the standard treatment for gunshot wounds was to pour boiling oil directly onto the injury. The idea was to cauterize the wound and prevent infection. But as you can imagine, the agony was unimaginable. One fateful day in 1537, Paré ran out of oil during a battle. Forced to improvise, he concocted a mixture of egg yolks, rose oil, and turpentine, yes, the paint thinner. To his astonishment, his patients fared much better than those treated with boiling oil. Sometimes, necessity really is the mother of invention. If you think your shampoo has a strange scent, be grateful you weren't around in medieval times. Back then, Barbers often used aged human urine as a hair cleanser. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, a natural cleaning and bleaching agent. The Romans had already discovered its power for whitening togas, and medieval barbers believed it could give hair a healthy shine. They even bottled and sold it. Talk about a side hustle. Running low on shaving soap? No problem, just reach for a pint. According to a 1498 document from Oxford University, barbers who couldn't afford soap would use the frothy foam from beer to lather up their clients' faces. It was cheap, effective, and probably made for a rather convivial atmosphere in the barber's chair. Why this never caught on with modern brands like Gillette is anyone's guess. Dental hygiene was a challenge in the Middle Ages, but that didn't stop barbers from offering teeth-whitening services. Their secret weapon? Forties water, a fancy name for highly corrosive nitric acid. It certainly stripped away stains, but it also stripped away tooth enamel, leaving teeth vulnerable to decay and destruction. Sometimes a dazzling smile came at a terrible price. Surgery without anesthesia is a terrifying thought, but medieval barbers had their own solution, the soporific sponge. This was an early attempt at anesthesia, made by soaking a sea sponge in a potent cocktail of opium, hemlock, mandrake, and other ingredients. The dried sponge would be rehydrated and held under the patient's nose, sending them into a deep sleep, or, tragically, sometimes into a deeper slumber from which they never awoke. If you ever complained about the taste of cough syrup, consider this. Medieval doctors sometimes prescribed white Greek, the chalky crust that forms on aging dog droppings. For sore throats and tonsillitis, it was even applied to dissolve tumors. And dog poop wasn't alone. Mouse droppings were used for intestinal worms, and the dung of various animals found its way into all sorts of remedies. Sometimes the cure really was worse than the disease. Barbers proudly advertised their bloodletting skills by displaying jars of blood in their shop windows. Over time, the blood would coagulate and rot, filling the air with a stench so foul that in 1309, London passed a law banning the practice. The solution? Dumping the blood into the River Thames. The next time you hear the term operating room, remember that medieval surgery was often a public spectacle, with barbers removing kidney stones in front of a live audience to lure in customers. Toothache plagued the ancient Egyptians, thanks to the sand in their bread and poor oral hygiene. Their solution: grinding up a dead rat, making a paste, and applying it to the aching tooth. The remedy persisted through the Middle Ages and even in rural England into the early 20th century before finally falling out of fashion. Sometimes progress is simply the act of discarding old ideas. Not all medieval remedies were as revolting as dog dung or dead rats. For sore throats, coughs, and even burns, people turned to snail jelly. Garden snails were collected, shelled, and mixed with sugar to create a soothing gel. Women also used snail slime to beautify their skin, a practice that, believe it or not, has made a comeback in modern cosmetics. Snail mucin is now a prized ingredient in many beauty creams, thanks to its ability to stimulate collagen and elastin. And if you think the story of medieval medicine ends here, think again. The ingenuity, and sometimes sheer desperation, of our ancestors led to a treasure trove of curious practices. Leeches, for example, were a staple in the medieval medical toolkit, used to balance the humors by drawing blood from patients. This wasn't just a European quirk. Leech therapy was practiced from India to the Middle East, and remarkably, it's made a comeback in modern microsurgery, where leeches help restore blood flow to delicate tissues. Another fascinating fact: medieval hospitals were often run by religious orders, and care was as much about the soul as the body. Patients were treated with prayers, relics, and rituals alongside whatever physical remedies were available. The concept of quarantine, which we now associate with modern pandemics, actually has its roots in the 14th century, when ships suspected of carrying plague were required to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, before docking in Venice. Even the barber's iconic red and white pole has a story rooted in these medical traditions. The swirling stripes represent blood and bandages, a nod to the barber's dual role as both groomer and healer. Next time you pass a barber shop, you're seeing a living relic of a time when a haircut and a minor surgery could be performed in the same chair. Despite the strangeness of these treatments, they were born from a relentless drive to heal and to understand the mysteries of the human body. Every odd remedy, every risky experiment, was a step, however small or misguided, toward the medical knowledge we have today. The next time you reach for a painkiller or visit a doctor, remember, the path to modern medicine was paved with snail jelly, boiling oil, leeches, and a whole lot of curiosity. History, after all, is not just a record of what we got right, but a chronicle of our boldest attempts to solve the puzzles of life. And who knows, the remedies we take for granted today may seem just as strange to future generations. The adventure of discovery, it seems, is never truly over.